Welcome to 4-H Salsa Gardening with Kids. This presentation is a joint effort of Arlington, Alexandria Extension Master Gardeners and Arlington 4-H. I'm Debbie Keefe, and Scarlett Swan.
Hello, everyone.
Is my intern partner there. We were members of the 2019 Extension Master Gardener class. We spent 60 hours in the classroom and doing hands-on instruction and took an exam. We are now Master Gardener Interns, so we are doing 60 hours of internship. Unfortunately, we couldn't be in one of the schools in Arlington in the afternoon this year. We had planned to be at one of the schools working with gardening with kids, actual kids in a 6-week program. But with COVID-19, with schools closing, that didn't happen. So Caitlin proposed that we put together this 1-hour webinar for extended day staff instead. First, a little bit about Master Gardening and about 4-H. We are part of Virginia Cooperative Extension. VCE is an educational network that is supported by Virginia Tech and Virginia State University. They share knowledge. VCE shares information and educational tools with the general public on how to improve everyday lives. Every state in the U.S. has a cooperative extension program that's administered through land-grant universities. Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia is a group of trained volunteers with Virginia Cooperative Extension, and we serve Alexandria and Arlington counties. We run a help desk that's located in Arlington. We staff plant clinics at 2 libraries, one in Arlington, the Central Library Plant Clinic there, and one at Beatley Library in Alexandria, and also at farmers markets in both Alexandria and Arlington. We also maintain demonstration gardens in the communities, and we distribute seed to neighborhoods. 4-H is a community of young people across America who are learning leadership, citizenship, and life skills. I think their purpose is best described with the 4-H pledge. I pledge my head to clearer thinking, my heart to greater loyalty, my hands to larger service, and my health to better living. Now, in this next hour, Scarlett and I will demonstrate how to design a gardening program with kids. It would be taught over 6 weeks, meeting once a week with the kids after school, or it could be used as a unit of instruction. But what you should understand is that there's no way that in 6 weeks you're going to actually plant seeds and yield a harvest in a garden. It doesn't matter what kind of garden you're doing. But what we do want to do is to teach children about gardening. The goals for today are to answer some questions. Why garden with kids? What do plants need to grow? How do you grow vegetables from seed to harvest? We'll have some rainy day plans or activities that you can use with the children as you're working with them, and how to make salsa at the end. So Scarlett now is going to answer the question, why a salsa garden?
Hi. Why did we choose to grow a salsa garden? Salsa is nutritious, it's easy to prepare, but most kids probably think of it as something you buy at the grocery store, or more likely something that comes with your chips at a restaurant. We're using salsa as an example to show that food comes from plants. You can plant a seed, grow it, you can harvest the fruit from a plant, and make a great snack. We want kids to know that gardening is fun and a productive outdoor activity. A simple salsa can be made from the 4 ingredients that we're going to grow in our garden: tomatoes, jalapeno peppers, scallions, and cilantro. You won't be able to grow fruit-bearing plants from seed in the 6 weeks that most programs run, but you will be able to plant seeds and see them grow. You can plant bedding plants. You can talk about how long it will take the plants to form fruit, and if you buy bedding plants, you'll probably be able to watch fruit form and ripen on the plants. And at the end, you can make a simple salsa from the fruit your plants produce, or more likely from produce you purchased, or even a combination of things you've grown and things you've bought. One thing to consider when planning a salsa garden program or any vegetable garden program is how long a plant takes to actually produce ripe fruit. It's great to plant seeds and watch them grow, and we think that should be part of your program. But realistically, few have the time or resources to shepherd plants all the way from the seed to the fruiting stage. But if you buy bedding plants, you can watch the plants flower and fruit begin to form. You'll bring down your weight for fruit substantially, as is shown in this slide. You can see that jalapeno peppers from seed to harvest take over 120 days. You can cut that in half by buying bedding plants with blooms on them. Same for the peppers, which take about 107 days minimum to go from seed to fruit ripe. You can cut that down to about a month. Scallions take much less time, only 60 days from seed formation, from seed to being able to harvest them. But again, you can cut that in half if you buy what are called sets. And I did want to explain that for scallions, you can plant the seeds, but if you buy the bedding plants, they're not called bedding plants, they're called sets. And your cilantro is your quickest harvest. It's only 45 days from seed to being able to harvest it. And if you buy bedding plants, you can start harvesting almost immediately. And this is one of the reasons that Debbie and I think you should probably grow some cilantro, both from a bedding plant, but also from seed. Now Debbie is going to talk to you about what conditions your little plants will need to grow and thrive.
So we could take, and I certainly could not teach, entire classes on the scientific studies of different aspects of gardening. But our target audience here is around 2nd or 3rd grade. You could use the information that we're presented with younger children in a simpler form, or with older children in the form in which we're giving it. But basically the target audience is about 2nd grade. So we should stick with the basics about what plants need. This is a mnemonic device or an acronym that you could use to teach them about the things that we need to consider before we plant the garden. First, we need to consider the place. Starts with a P. We need a container or a garden for the roots to grow. In this presentation, we'll talk about making little seed pots as a container. We'll talk about planting them in a larger pot. We'll talk about a raised bed, but you could also just plant the plants in an open garden space. Plants need light to grow. They need direct sunlight, or they need artificial light. That would be a grow light inside. They need air to grow so that they can have both oxygen and carbon dioxide. And this isn't just air above the ground, but it's air in the soil too. Plants need nutrients to grow. They need nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and other nutrients. They get this through organic matter that's in the soil. It's a complicated chemistry that 2nd graders don't need to understand, but they can understand that just like we need nutrition, we need nutrients that are found in the vitamins in the foods that we eat, plants will get nutrients from our organic matter that's in the soil. Plants have thirst, so they'll need water, lots of it, but not too much. And of course, they'll need soil or other growing medium in which to grow. The soil will need to be lightweight or broken apart, and it'll need to drain well. The next slide shows a photo of a seed packet. When you're deciding what seeds you're going to plant, you'll need to read the seed packets very carefully, and there's a wealth of information that's on the back side of a seed packet. Usually there is a description of the plant and its uses, and there's also a lot of the how-tos. This particular one speaks of sowing, which means planting the seed. It has information about thinning, transplanting and thinning, and the space needed in order to grow these seeds. Has information about whether to start the seeds indoors or outdoors. There's information here about germination. Germination just means the time it takes for you to see active growth of the plant from the time it's in the soil. And also, there's usually information about soil temperature. Sometimes it's just a reference like this to soil temperature. So there's a range of the number of days that it will take for the seed to germinate, because the temperature may vary. There's usually other information included. Here you'll see that there's a reference to the fruit, this Roma tomato, producing fruit over a longer growing season. It doesn't just produce one harvest of fruit, but throughout the growing season, you'll have more tomatoes that are produced. Sometimes on a seed packet, you'll see a little map with what are called hardiness zones in the United States. Most of us live in zone 7. And the hardiness zone map will give you information on the average date of the last frost of the season and the first frost of the fall. That is an average though. So for instance, this past weekend, we're well past the average frost date for where we live in Northern Virginia. But this past weekend, there were freeze warnings well into May. So I had to cover tender plants in my backyard to protect them from the cold, and that will happen. Usually the seed packet will also tell you when the seeds in that package were placed there for sale, and a sell-by date. This is not a hard and firm date. Those seeds can be used. This one says packed for 2020, sell by 10/31/20. But these seeds would be fine to use next year or even the next year, as long as they're kept in a very dry, cool place so that they don't germinate inside the package. It's really important to read the seed packet and follow the instructions carefully for best results. What follows now is a video of how to make seedling pots that you can plant directly into the soil, and how to start tomato seeds that you would keep indoors. Scarlett and I decided for our salsa garden that we would keep it basic. We are going to plant Roma tomatoes, jalapeno peppers, bunching onions, which would be the same as a green onion or scallion, and cilantro. Now, there's a wealth of information on the back of every seed packet. You'll find out when you look at it, when to plant, where to plant, whether indoors or outside, how far apart to space things, and the time. the time it takes for the seeds to germinate. So the cilantro and the bunching onions generally go directly into the ground. So we'll be planting the Roma tomatoes and the peppers in seed pots, which is a fun activity for kids to make. Here is a sample of a paper seed pot that's made from strips of a bag, grocery bag that has just been wrapped and tucked. Same with strips of newspaper you could use to make a paper pot. You can use egg crates or even an egg shell, just the bottom half of the shell to plant in. I think the easiest with kids and just to manage is to take a toilet paper roll and to cut the bottom. What you do is, I'll do this one and show you. You cut about 3/4 of an inch up, you tuck the ends under, and voila, your little pot. When we plant seeds in seedling pots, it's best to use a potting mix and not garden soil, yard soil. If you use the potting mix, you get better drainage, there's more nutrient, and there's better air circulation. It's generally a mix of perlite, vermiculite, and peat moss. We fill the little pot with our mix. The seeds for the pepper and tomato plants are tiny. So what you do is I would suggest you just have the child drop the seed onto the surface. You would have marked a pencil about 1/4 of an inch, which is what the package indicates for both peppers and for tomato plants. Push it down, push the little seed down under the soil until it's about the depth of the marking on the pencil, and then just tamp down very gently. And then you'll mist the surface with water. It's better to use a mister for these because the plants that do come up are so tiny, you don't want to hit them with a blast of water. And then I would take a small piece of plastic wrap, cover the top. This will help to keep moisture inside. It creates a mini greenhouse. And voila, there's your first little seed pot. This now will be placed in a warm spot in your house, a warm sunny spot, and you probably need to check it every day to make sure that the soil is moist.
Thanks, Debbie. Sorry.
So when the seeds are planted, it's recommended that you find a location in the school where you can monitor the progress of the growth. Only about 70% of seeds that you plant actually germinate. So if you have them in a controlled place where a teacher or a staff member is monitoring the water, the warmth, and that sort of thing, the children are more likely to actually see the seedlings as they grow. But at some point, you'll send them home with the kids, hopefully. And it's important to send instructions home with the seedlings so that parents or caregivers will understand what it is that they're supposed to do with the plants. The information that you would include in your care instructions, you just find on the back of the seed packet, as I indicated before. It's nice to include the complete name of the plant, and by that I mean use the scientific or Latin name for the plant as well as the common name. Give instructions on the basic requirements, how much light they need, how much water they need. Include directions about how to transplant them. And that includes would include a note about unfolding the bottom of that paper towel tube. If you have 4 layers of cardboard that are folded over one another, then it's likely that they will not break down in the soil, and you'll end up with a plant that is that's pot bound. The roots don't grow out into the soil because the 4 layers never completely break down. Now Scarlett is going to share some information on gardening in a pot.
So the next video is going to be me planting our salsa garden in a pot. And I thought we'd go over first the materials you need. You'll need a pot, and a large pot, at least 16 inches wide for the number of plants we're going to put in it, and at least 15 inches deep, especially for the tomato, which needs a lot of soil depth to grow well. You'll need to make sure that your pot has at least 4 drainage holes in the bottom, and you'll want to fill it with potting mix. Like Debbie said, don't use soil from the ground. You'll want to fill it with potting mix because it will drain better, has more nutrients, etc. You'll want some vegetable fertilizer on hand, a trowel. You'll want to be able to water your plants. And these are the plants that I'm going to plant in the large pot. I'm going to put 1 Roma tomato, 1 jalapeno pepper. You'll see me put 2 cilantro bedding plants, but we do suggest you also plant a couple seeds. You will not see me plant any scallions because we added them to our list after we did our filming. But theoretically, you would add also 5 scallions to this little garden in a pot. Let's watch the video.
So we're going to plant our salsa garden in a pot today. We're going to put our potting soil in. I've got my potting mix in here now. I filled my container up to within 1 inch or 2 of the top. I'm going to give it a little water because we don't want to put our plants into really dry soil. I'm going to take my trowel and mix it in so that the soil is uniformly moist. Now let's have a look at our plants. This is a Roma tomato. It's got a little height on it. It is a vine. Tomatoes are a vine. Tomato plants are unusual in that you can plant them deeper than the soil line that's in the pot. Tomato plant will grow roots all along the stem for as deep as you plant it. So we want to anchor it in the ground so that once it's big and full of hopefully fruit, it won't tip over. When you have your kids plant the tomatoes, you want to make sure to let them never pull a plant by the stem. So what you want to do is put your fingers on either side of the stem and dump the plant out. Now you'll see that it has some nice roots, not too many. Sometimes you may find that the roots are all twisted around. We call that pot bound, and that's not a good thing. So, but this doesn't look too pot bound, so we're gonna dig a hole for it. Ready to plant it, and you don't want to plant these stems. So I'm gonna gently break them off. Another thing I wanted to show you on this particular plant was it has something we call a sucker, just the beginning of one. And this is a great thing to do with the kids because you don't want these suckers. Here you can see it just starting to come out between 2 pieces of the vine. And those will get really big and rob your tomato plant of its energy that it should be using to make fruit. Another thing I wanted to show you is this is the beginning of a little flower that will turn into tomatoes. So now we'll just pop it in the hole and cover it up with dirt. Because it grows to be so big, you'll want to have some sort of structure to contain the vine. This is a tomato cage. We'll put that around the tomato gently, as deep as you can get it, because this tomato plant will grow and be really big and heavy. So as it grows up, we'll want to keep it within the cage and above the rings. Next thing we're going to plant is our Jalapeno pepper. The pepper plant, unlike the tomato plant, must be planted with the same soil line in this pot as in that pot. The pepper plant also has suckers, you can see. And you'll want to do the same thing, or have the kids do the same thing. Watch those pepper plants for the suckers, because they're kind of fun to gently take off. I'm going to put my pepper plant back here. We're going to do the same thing with the pepper that we did with the tomato. Put your fingers around the stem, dump it gently out. It's got a little more root structure than the tomato did. So I am going to tease these roots out just a little bit. Then we're just going to put it in a little hole and put the soil around it. We've got our cilantro. I'm doing 2 cilantros in there. These are not great looking cilantro plants, but they should be fine. So we're going to do the same thing with the cilantro we did with the others. Sort of put your fingers around the plants, tap it out of the whole pot. Okay. This one might be more root bound. Oh, definitely root bound. So there you can see something that's really root bound. Another reason why it probably is not so happy. So this one we really do need to tease out the roots. It's even okay if some of them tear off, though it'll grow new roots. So tease them out so that they're not restricted like they were in the pot. There we go. And just dig your hole pretty far away from your pepper and as far away from your tomato as you can get, because the tomato will really take over. Again, maintain that soil line. And same thing with this one. I think this one's root bound too. There we go. Again, root bound. So just tease those out a little bit. Your little hole and pop your plants in there. Now, I'm also going to just give these guys a little fertilizer. I'm using all-purpose fertilizer. You may want to buy some specialized vegetable fertilizer, but I'm just going to take a little bit of it and sprinkle it around the plant. And I'm going to work it in a little bit with my fingers into just the very top of the soil. The last thing we're going to do, of course, is give it some water. Because if you don't water it in, you won't be happy plants. There you go. I would give it a good drink of water. Thoroughly wet it. And there you go. In about 2 or 3 months, this will be this tall. This will be this tall. These will be this tall. And it will be just a full, lush garden of salsa vegetables. Enjoy.
So if your school doesn't have a terrace with large pots or an existing raised bed or even a space for an in-ground garden, it's pretty easy to construct a frame for a raised bed. When you're looking for information on the science of gardening, it's important to use, if you're Googling, to use websites that have .edu in the web address. That way you're getting scientifically accurate information. When you're constructing a raised bed though, you'll find that there are commercial sites that actually will provide ideas about how to construct them. I have a raised bed in my yard that my husband built for me. My main considerations in that construction were the size of the bed. I had to decide how large I wanted it, and also the material to use, what kind of wood. For organic vegetable gardening, which is what we're doing, gardening without the use of any kinds of pesticides, then what we want to do is to use wood that has not been treated. And as of 2003, the pressure treated wood that you buy at a construction supply store would not be treated with some of the really harsh chemicals that were used prior to that, but they are still treated with chemicals that are, for instance, kill fungus or just to help to maintain the life of that wood. So it's best to use wood that has not been treated when you're building a raised bed. The next video that you'll see is the raised bed in my yard. When you're planting outdoors, the way that you put the plants in the ground is very similar to what you saw earlier when Scarlett planted in a pot. The biggest difference is that there's a little more prep of the soil just because you have more space here. So I placed the box here and worked the soil, the existing soil, to a depth of about 8 inches, broke it up. Then I added some mix, some soil mix. I added some leaf mulch and worked it all in. The additional part was another 4 inches on top. It settled a little, but I probably have 10 to 12 inches of good soil here that I planted the vegetables in. As I said, the box is, the raised bed is 4 by 4. It's important when you're working with children to remember that they're smaller than we adults are, so they need to be able to reach the plants that they're working with. You don't want them to have to stand in the bed to be able to reach. I left walking space around the entire bed so that children could work from either of the 4 sides. If I put it against a wall, obviously they would be walking through the bed to reach the back of the box. So here we have 4 cilantro plants that I have put in. Here we have 3 jalapeno pepper plants. We have 2 tomato plants here, and I'm seeding green onions here directly into the soil. The location of the bed is important because the plants need 6 to 8 hours of sunlight. The location of this bed is such that this is the east and this is the west side. South obviously is in this direction, and the sun is a little lower in the sky at this time of year. So you wouldn't want to have your taller plants at the front of the raised bed and the shorter ones back, because obviously then the taller plants would shade the shorter plants. It's also important that the bed be located close to a water source. You don't want to have to haul buckets of water or have the kids haul buckets of water to water the bed.
Thanks. If you've planted seeds in your little pots, you're going to be eagerly anticipating their appearance above the soil. But before they make their appearance, you need to keep the seeds warm and damp. Like Debbie showed you, many people cover the container during this period to maintain that constant moistness. If you've covered your seed pots, you need to be sure to remove the covering once the seedling comes above the ground. If you leave the covering on for too long and it's very damp in there, your seed may well start to rot, and that will cause it to die. So I wanted to show you these 2 sets of images of a tomato life cycle. I couldn't decide which one was better because they showed different things. So let's talk about the top one first. You can see the tomato plant on the ground, and you can see that it's actually those little seeds in the tomato plant that go into the ground, develop into a plant that develops fruit, which ripens. And this is why I love this particular set of images. The plant dies because that's what they do. They want to reproduce. So once they've given you the ripe fruit, they figure their job is done. I've made my seeds, I can die now. So this is the natural way of tomato plants. They don't stay alive forever. So you can also see by the dying plant on the ground, you see the tomato there on the ground. and the seeds, it's decomposing, will go into the soil. Next year, there'll be a little patch of tomato seedlings there. At least that's what happens in my garden. So let's look at the bottom line of illustrations now. You can see the little seed going into the ground and how important water is. This is one of the reasons I like this set of illustrations, because the next little drawing shows you a seedling, which looks nothing like your tomato plant is going to look. Skinny little stalk with two tiny little leaves that have smooth edges. So this is your seedling that you'll want to nurture. Very soon, your smooth-edged seedling leaves will be joined by true tomato leaves, several sets of them. It is at this point, between around the size of the like third and fourth pictures here, so 4 to 6 inches tall with multiple sets of true leaves, that you're going to want to put your seedling tomatoes or your bedding tomatoes into the ground. So into your large pot or into your raised bed, into the ground. And so your true leaves will be jagged, bigger, multiple sets. Your plants will be in the ground. So you've either put your seedling pots into the ground or you put your bedding plants into the ground. And you want to make them happy. So let's look at what chores you can do to make your plants happy in the next slide. Probably the most important thing you can do is keep your plants consistently moist. So this means just enough water. The soil needs to be moist, but not waterlogged. The best way to know when to water is not to wait until your plant wilts, then it's too late, but to instead stick your finger in the soil a couple of inches deep. If the second inch down is still dry, it's time to water your plants. Fertilizer, which is not on this list, but nonetheless important. So you saw that we put some fertilizer on your plants when we put them in the ground. So you don't need to fertilize again until your plant sets fruit. That means that it is flowered and the flowers have died off, and you can see the tiny little beginning of a fruit, a little green ball for your tomatoes and your peppers. So once your plant sets fruit, you're going to want to look and read carefully the instructions on your fertilizer, whichever kind you got. And you'll be applying it every week or every 2 weeks, according to whatever the package says. But what we do want to emphasize is that after you put the fertilizer on, you need to water it in. Don't water before you fertilize, water after you fertilize. The water helps carry the nutrients from the fertilizer down to the roots of the plant. Next, you'll want to, at least once a week, look over your garden for weeds. If you've planted your plants in a pot, weeds probably won't be a huge issue. But if they're in the ground or in a raised bed, you'll want to look out for those weeds, and you'll want to keep the area free of them. Weeds, for our purposes now, are anything that is not your food crop. Although some weeds are really pretty and they have nice flowers, if you let them continue to grow in your bed there, they will rob your plants of the moisture from the soil, the nutrients from the soil, the space that plants need to get bigger, and also if you let them get really big, they'll even take the sunshine away from the plants, which brings me to something I forgot to say when we were talking about putting your plants in a pot. And that is that these plants require a good deal of sun. So you'll need to place your pot somewhere, especially for the tomatoes and peppers, where it gets at least 6 and preferably more hours of sun every day. So after you have weeded, we're going to go to the next slide. You want to look at your peppers and your tomatoes for suckers. And I showed you a sucker on the video, but this is a much better picture of a larger sucker. And if you let these things go, they'll get as big as any stem on the plant. And you don't want that to happen. The suckers rob your plant's energy from fruit production. So And plus, you know, they're fun to take off. So you gently remove the suckers. Just try looking for them once a week on your tomatoes and your pepper plants. And now let's look at the cilantro in the next slide. Cilantro does something called bolting. And it's the quickest producer in your salsa garden. So you'll be able to harvest it sooner probably than anything else. If you've used bedding plants like I did in the video, they will quickly do something called bolting. And that means that they send up a flower stem and develop flowers, which are pretty, but this also means that the harvestable part of your cilantro plant is done. Because like the tomato plant, it's the urge of a plant, it's their job to reproduce themselves. And after they reproduce themselves, they can die. So this little cilantro plant is putting up flowers, and those flowers will turn into seeds, and then the plant knows it's okay to die. So we want to delay that dying process as long as we can so we have salsa to use. We do recommend, because it develops so quickly, that you do plant cilantro seeds, and that you do it successively. And that means that you plant someone when you plant your garden, but you'll also a couple of weeks later plant some more, and a couple of weeks after that you'll plant some more seeds, and that way you have a more constant harvest of cilantro leaves to use in all sorts of cooking. Okay, so let's look at how big the plants get in the next slide. You'll probably thinking, wow, Debbie and Scarlett planted those things so far apart, those tiny little plants. And there's a reason for that. They get big. As you can see on this chart, the tomatoes can get to be 5 or more feet tall and 18 inches wide. The jalapenos will grow to be 2 feet tall, again, 18 inches wide. Your cilantro could possibly grow to 2 feet, although you don't want that to happen because it'll probably be bolting at that point. And the scallions also get to be 1 foot tall. So they will quickly take up the entire pot or your entire garden bed. Now Debbie is going to talk to you about garden-related activities to do while you're waiting for your plants to grow.
So as Scarlett said, when you're maintaining your garden, you're waiting for your plants to grow, you're going to be doing a little bit of watering, a little bit of weeding, and a lot of watching and waiting. So it's important to have lots of activities that you could use to fill that time, lots of activities that are garden related that you could do on a rainy day when you can't go outside. When Scarlett and I began planning to be in a school this spring, we were given by Caitlin a curriculum that we could use with a program called Literature in the Garden. It's published by Texas AgriLife Extension at Texas A&M. Texas is land-grant university, and it was a joint project of junior master gardeners and 4-H. The curriculum is just chock full of activities that teach kids about gardening through literature, through games, through keeping journals, through craft activities, through songs that you can teach them. The next slide shows, Caitlin, could I have the next slide?
Which one are you looking for?
I'm sorry, the books, the children's books, thanks. This slide shows the children's books that are included in that curriculum. They're gorgeous, gorgeous storybooks that are very appropriate to be read to children who are elementary aged. The one at the top left there, Tops and Bottoms, is especially appropriate for the kind of gardening that we are doing here, because it teaches about the different types of, the different parts of the plant that you can eat. The next slide has an activity on gardening with the 5 senses. This is just a sheet. It could be, you know, printed as a worksheet that the kids could use. It could be done as a poster. But it has to do with gardening with all your senses. You could use it outdoors at your garden bed, where the kids would talk about what they see in the garden, what they hear when they're outdoors there, what the vegetables or even the leaves taste like, how they feel, how they smell. Also, this could be used inside. You know, if you bring in a bunch of cilantro, throw it on a plate in the middle of a table or a workspace, and have the kids touch it, have them taste it, have them see it, smell it, and talk about using those 5 senses when you're gardening. The next slide shows another activity that could be used. You could simply print terms that you use for gardening with pictures that you could use to make a match game for the kids. They could take these home at the end. This is a game that could be used individually by the kids, or they could play a match game as a group. The last activity that I photographed here is one that has to do with the life cycle of the tomato. These are simply sheets that have been printed. I colored them in, which you could have kids do, attach them to a clothesline in the proper sequence for the life cycle of a tomato. These could be used at the end of the gardening club. They could staple the sheets together in book form and take them home. It's just an example of an activity that you could use. But it's really important to be ready with lots of these kinds of activities, because again, you'll be doing a lot of waiting. But there's also a lot of information available, either through a specific curriculum like the one that we were going to use, or go to those .edu websites. A lot of the extension services offer different kinds of gardening activities for kids on their websites. Now Scarlett is going to describe our harvest.
So let's talk about when you're going to harvest your fruit that hopefully you've grown. The tomatoes are easy. These are some Roma tomatoes, and you can see that some of them are ripe. So as soon as they're red, all the way from the bottom to the top, you can pick them. Don't wait till the entire cluster is red. Pick them as the individual tomatoes become ripe. The next picture shows you jalapenos. And so interesting, there are different colored jalapenos on that bush. Well, if you leave your green jalapenos on, they will turn red. But we're going to suggest that you pick them when they are looking like the green one. Yes, there you go. 4 to 6 inches long, shiny green. Nothing bad will happen if you leave them on the plant. They're very pretty when they turn red. But 2 things. It will take longer, so you'll have to wait longer to use them. And as they become red, the flavor intensifies. And we think the green ones are just fine for the heat level we want in the salsa we're making. And I want to forget to tell you, so these are hot peppers. And if you've worked with them in your kitchen, you know that you cannot touch your eyes after you've touched a hot pepper, because it will burn your eyes. We don't want you guys to have crying children in the garden. So we suggest that if the children are going to pick the jalapenos, they should be wearing gloves. And if they don't have gloves, then maybe you should have an adult pick your jalapenos. Let's go on to the next picture, which is your scallions in the ground. There are a couple ways to know when your scallions are ready to harvest. One is 60 days from when you planted the seed, they should be ready. Another is if you planted sets, 30 days after you planted your sets, they should be ready to harvest. But if you've lost all track of that, you can measure. So as soon as your scallions are 8 to 12 inches tall and the leaves are about 1/2 inch wide, you can harvest your scallions. If you don't harvest them when they're that size, they will continue to grow into onions. But again, we wanted the milder flavor of a scallion, a very young onion, as opposed to the more intense flavor of a larger onion. So we suggest you harvest them when they're relatively young. Now on to our cilantro. Cilantro is such a popular herb, but it is a bit short-lived, as we talked about with the bolting. So to increase the useful lifespan of your cilantro plant, harvesting it regularly will help a lot. It's easy to harvest. You wait until it gets to be about 6 inches tall. Then you cut off, this woman is, this looks like a child, cutting it in this picture is using scissors, that's great. When it gets to be 6 inches tall, cut off the top 1/3 of the plant, and that's what you use to cook with. The bottom 2/3 will generate a new crop of leaves in as little time as a week. So remember, if your cilantro bolts, the useful life of your cilantro plant is over, at least for making salsa. To make sure that you have cilantro when you're going to harvest your tomatoes. A good tip is that wait until your tomato flowers are starting to wilt. If you plant some cilantro seeds when your tomato flowers are wilting, you should be able to harvest fresh cilantro at the same time, weather conditions, agreeing, that you harvest your ripe tomatoes. In the next slide, we're going to talk about the plants of the parts of the plant we eat. And one of the reasons Debbie and I were drawn to a salsa garden is that it does illustrate we're growing crops where you eat different parts of the plant. Obviously, for the jalapenos and the tomatoes, we're going to eat the fruit. But for the cilantro, you can eat just the leaves, or you can eat the leaves and the stems. And most interesting is the scallion, because, what part do you eat? What do you call that part you eat? You can eat the green part above the ground, which are the leaves, but mostly we want to eat not the roots, which is maybe what the kids will say because it's below the ground, but we eat the bulb of the scallion. So the roots, as you know, when you pick them, you'll see the roots are the things you cut off and throw away at the bottom. So we eat the bulb and possibly the leaves of the scallion. Now Debbie is going to show you how to use those leaves, stems, bulbs, and fruits to make salsa.
This is the recipe that Scarlett and I used for our salsa gardening fruits and vegetables. We used all 4 tomatoes, peppers, cilantro, and scallions. Directions, of course, you have the kids wash and dry the produce. You remove the core from the tomatoes and the peppers and chop them. I do not use the jalapeno seeds because it makes the sauce a little too spicy for my taste, but you could certainly use that. With the cilantro, you can either use just the leaves or the leaves and the stems, chop them or cut them with scissors. And for the scallions, you slice or cut with scissors, the leaves, the green part at the top. You cut off the root, which is the hairy part at the very bottom of the scallion, and then either slice or chop the bulb, which is, I believe, actually part of the stem. You can add optional ingredients. Here we've suggested a clove of garlic, some lime juice, and salt to taste. One thing that I would suggest is that if you don't actually harvest from your school's salsa garden and you go and buy the products in the grocery store that you're going to use to make your salsa at the end, because of timing, I suggest that you have the whole, regardless of whether the children are allowed to actually do the chopping themselves with knives of the tomatoes and the peppers and the cilantro and scallions. I suggest that you have those whole vegetables right there, and the fruit, the tomato fruit, of course, so that they can see what those products look like, what that harvest looks like. Because again, to some kids, salsa comes in a jar, and you want them to see that they've actually gone from a seed to a product at the end, a harvest, a recipe, something that you've made. So moving along, there's a little video here of our salsa. Now we have our harvest. We have our tomatoes, we have our onions, we have our cilantro, and we have our jalapeno pepper. We also have a few optional ingredients that are in our recipe. I like lime in my salsa and a little garlic, and I like to salt the tomatoes. So here we go. I've already chopped all these vegetables and prepared them. It's really, really good for the kids to be able to participate in that, whether it's just washing the vegetables, whether it's actually chopping them, whether it's in the mixing, but for them to be able to see that we planted seeds, that we took care of the plants as they grew, that we watered them and cared for them. And now we're going to celebrate with a salsa party. It's fun. Here we go. All our ingredients here. That's good. Dip the container here. Let's taste it. My salsa.
Mmm. Very good.
Okay?
Very
Debbie and I would like to thank you all for joining us today to learn about salsa gardening with kids. I see we've run a little over our time. I apologize for that. We'd be remiss if we didn't also thank our wonderful 4-H agent, Caitlin Verdu, for her assistance and guidance. It was invaluable. We couldn't have done it without her. And we also want to give a shout out to family members that helped us, especially Debbie's older daughter, who did all of our videoing. If you have any questions about the information we presented today, or about gardening in general, we want to point you towards the Extension Master Gardener Help Desk. And you can see the email address on the screen now. The office is closed, but we are still answering emails at the help desk. And if you have questions about a 4-H program at your school in Arlington County, you can contact Caitlin. Her contact information is here. And if you are outside of our viewing area, because we are recording this, you can contact the Master Gardener group in your area, and you can contact your local 4-H extension agent for help. And thank you again so much for joining us. I'm sorry we've run over our time. Do we have any time left for questions, Caitlin?
Well, Scarlett, I have excellent news for you, which is we didn't start until 1:06. So you are in fact 2 minutes ahead of schedule.
Okay.
I'm looking through the chat box now. One question that came up is, can you have salsa without hot peppers? What do you ladies think?
Absolutely.
Yes, definitely. You could just replace those with any kind of sweet pepper. A red pepper or red and green pepper would be perfectly fine in salsa.
I think salsa is kind of like soup. You know, you put in it what you have.
Yes.
But if it has tomatoes in it and onions, it's going to be like salsa. So
Excellent. I will keep looking through the chat, and folks who are listening, if you have any questions about salsa gardening, gardening with kids, your own personal gardens, we have another minute, you can put them in there. But in the meantime, Scarlett and Debbie, I have a question for you. If I were to do this project, what is the most likely thing to go wrong? What are some common problems you think I or someone else might experience?
Watering can be an issue. Not too much water, not too little water. Fertilizer can be an issue. Too much fertilizer. If you don't put any fertilizer on it, it's probably going to be fine, not as productive. I see the biggest issue that people have, certainly I have, is squirrels and birds eating the fruit when it gets ripe. And they're just thirsty. They want the liquid in that fruit, but once they've taken it off the vine and sucked all the juice out of it, it's left on your ground and it's not good for you. So that's probably the major issue.
Excellent. One other question you touched on in the presentation. So as you were talking about planting from seeds as opposed to planting from plants, looks like if I were to plant everything from seed, probably wouldn't have fruit that I could or food that I could harvest by the end of 6 weeks. So how do you propose doing a 6-week project, given that plants might need a little bit more time to grow?
What you're trying to do is to teach the children, in my view, that what they eat does come from seed. It's planted. And so what we're trying to do is provide them with snippets of that process. So you can plant the seeds in the little seedling pots, send them home with the kids. Perhaps they'll continue to grow until they're mature and producing fruit. I would also suggest that you plant the full plants in a planting bed so that you do end up with some kind of harvest. The other option is that if you do happen to have someone who is on a school site over the course of the summer who can maintain the garden, harvest the vegetables, you could, leave that bed in place into the summer so that someone could. But the final stage of it, that salsa party that we showed, actually demonstrates, shows you what fruits and vegetables come off those plants and the way in which you make it into food. I think that's the most important lesson for the children. Scarlett, any more to add?
No, I think that's right. We're just trying to show them that the stuff you buy at the grocery store comes from plants, or a great portion of it comes from plants, and that's the crux of the whole matter. And you can grow your food.
Yes.
Absolutely. If we have time, and Belinda, if we don't, please just unmute yourself and tell me to wrap it up. But I do have a $1,000 question for Scarlett and Debbie. Niru, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, wants to know, how do you keep squirrels out of your garden? What is your magic solution for that? Because she points out correctly that they could very well destroy your plants.
Yes, they can.
And they do.
And there's no magic solution except for keeping them away from your plants by fencing it in. That's not something I certainly can do in my garden. So the other option that sometimes people say is, you just plant enough for them to have some of them. And it's kind of what I did last year unintentionally. I got 3 tomatoes and they got everything else. So there you go. Debbie, do you have any other?
No, other than to say that if the squirrels eat all your tomatoes this season, there's always next season.
Excellent. And I think we have time for maybe one more question. I see a couple related to fertilizer. So what kind of fertilizer do you want to use? And when you plant 3 kinds of vegetables in one pot, how do you know how much you're supposed to fertilize that pot?
Oh, that's a great question. I'll start, Debbie, and then you can jump in.
Go ahead.
For the kind of fertilizer, you know, you saw that I used an all-purpose, and that's only because that's what I had in my garage, and we filmed this thing over a month ago. I would go and buy or order from Amazon these days an organic fertilizer that is formulated for vegetables. You can buy specialized tomato, but because we're growing other things too, I would just get a general vegetable fertilizer. And there are many different companies that make organic fertilizer. Debbie, do you right offhand know the names
I
of some
don't.
brands? Yeah, but you'll see them. They're clearly marked organic fertilizer.
And then the second part of that question was, how much fertilizer do you use?
I'd say read the package.
Absolutely.
Usually on the package, they will tell you how much, even in a container, to use. The instructions will have that information, and follow the instructions on the package.
And I would err on the side of too little rather than too much. Too much fertilizer can cause your plants to just produce a lot of foliage, which is not what you want. At least for the peppers and the tomatoes, you want the fruit. So if you can't figure it out, just do the least amount that they suggest. That would be my inclination.
Excellent. Well, I think we are out of time now for questions, but I would say for anyone who has any lingering questions or something that might come up later, the contact information for the Extension Master Gardener Help Desk is on my screen. They are wonderful. They will get back to you with everything you need to know. And if they don't know the answer, they'll help you find it. If you have any 4-H related questions, how do I bring junior master gardeners to my school? What else do you do? Please feel free to contact me. I've worked with a lot of people on this call. I know Belinda very well, so feel free to reach out.